Hello, I have been busy. I have been writing my thesis and my microphone is currently knackered. So both of these things have resulted in not many new videos coming out. And I basically wanted to break the silence. It's been quite nice having a bit of a break from videos. I've been making a video a week for nigh on 6 years. So it's the first time that I've had a sort of prolonged break from making videos. I'd like to get back into it soon, but as I say, the time is currently not there. But I'd like to try and get back to making maybe 1 or 2 videos in the month, which is a bit more manageable with all the other stuff that I've got on at the moment. Today, though, I thought I would turn on my phone and see if I'd be able to make a video like this and to share a little bit about what my thesis is on, and hopefully that would be interesting. So I'm writing a thesis at the moment. Some of you may know I lived in Norway for a little bit, and that was because I started my master's there in Oslo in Viking and medieval studies. And now I'm continuing with writing that thesis. And that thesis is about, very broadly speaking, pre-Christian religion as it pertains to Frisia, so the area of the northern Dutch and German coastlines, which was inhabited by a people who were labelled as the Frisians in the early Middle Ages. And these Frisians, like many of the surrounding peoples, were, before they became Christian, pagan or heathen or whatever term you might want to put on them. We can tell from the material culture in this area, so looking at jewelry, looking at runic inscriptions, and indeed a lot of the missionary accounts of what kind of things were going on in terms of religion, that they were quite closely related to surrounding peoples. So the Frisians came in from Scandinavia, from northern Germany, around about the 5th century. They moved into an area that had been largely depopulated following the Roman period, probably as a result of rising sea levels, but also as a result of different social networks that were changing around this time in a period that is known as the migration period. In any case, we can then see this link with people we might call the Anglo-Saxons, people that were coming in, moving from southern Schleswig-Holstein into areas of the southern North Sea coast, so Frisia, for example, Saxony, and then who also went over to England and would leave a strong mark on the culture there, and mingling with people that were already there to create new identities, which we today would call Anglo-Saxon. And indeed, some of them would also call Anglo-Saxon later on, but that's a whole other can of worms for a different video. What my thesis is about a law code. It's called the Lex Frisionum. It's a Latin term and it's written in Latin, but it's the law of the Frisians. This was a code that was compiled around about the end of the 8th century, so sometime before the year 800. This was just after that the last remaining independent part of Frisia, East Frisia, had been conquered by the Franks, or the Carolingian Empire as it would become, because it was Charlemagne who did the conquering. And what's interesting is that in this law code, while it's compiled by the Franks, it's written in Latin, so again, probably written by someone in the Christian church, it does have some pointers towards paganism. And that's because the Lex Frisionum is one of the leges barbarorum, which is a Latin term for the laws of the barbarians. It's not very PC. I don't think you'd get away with naming something like that today. But obviously Charlemagne didn't really do PC anyway, so he went ahead and called it that anyway. But what these are essentially laws that the Franks had drawn up to explain what the legal customs of Germanic-speaking peoples were who they just conquered. So there's also a Lex Salica, there's the Lex Saxonum, the Saxons, the Lex Thuringia, so the Lex of the Thuringian people, and so on and so forth. And the Lex Frisionum is the Frisian version of this law code. And what I'm focusing on are some of the pagan undertones that we see, in particular of the very last of these law provisions, capitula as it's called in Latin, so a chapter. And that chapter is what happens to someone who breaks into a fanum. And a fanum is another Latin word, and it's usually translated either to shrine or to sanctuary, sometimes to temple, along these lines. But what they actually mean by fanum is quite complicated. And that's taken up a lot of words in this thesis, believe you me. So I hope that whoever's going to be reading and marking it finds it as interesting as I apparently did. But this word fanum, it's important because this is a word that has been chosen from Latin. So we find it already back in the days when the Romans were pagans. They used it for some of their structures. And of course, when the Romans converted, then this word remained as a word for a shrine that was used for paganism. But it does have some kind of baggage then, because it's already been used in the classical period. And a lot of the monks that were coming over and doing missionary work in Northern Europe had these classical texts with them. So texts from beforehand from Rome. We know in England, for example, the missionaries that went there came from Rome. It was the Augustinian mission of the missionary Augustine. And he had brought with him many of the books of the liturgy, books of the Bible, books otherwise related to Christian teaching, exegetical books from Rome. And so you have this continuation of this tradition of Romans who were looking back at Roman pagan tradition being brought by missionaries who then encountered Germanic religion, but then often saw it through the lenses of someone who had read about and understood paganism in Roman terms, not in Germanic terms. So this is something to come to grips with, because obviously if your whole worldview of someone else's belief is based on a different belief, then what's to say that you're actually writing and describing things that are actually in front of you rather than what you think is in front of you? It's a little bit like the witch craze in some ways, that people were convinced that there were witches. And so even though we now today say, well, they weren't witches, these were just ordinary people that were maybe disliked by the community in some way, because they had that idea in their heads of there are witches, it completely changed how they saw the world and interpreted the world. And so in a similar way, if you've got a preconceived notion, maybe based on classical texts, based a lot of the time on biblical understandings of pagans, then that would also change what these missionaries would write about Germanic pagan peoples, even if it doesn't quite match up. So that's been one of the fun and challenging things of working with some of these sources that describe various pagan sacred places, is probably the safest word to call it. There are some that describe it as a temple. I think this word has too many classical connotations. We think of pillars and sort of very grand buildings, roofed buildings, whereas from the evidence that we can tell, there's not too many of those. In fact, the best place we have for these cult buildings, as the archaeologists prefer to refer to them as, is from Scandinavia. And the overwhelming evidence there are that these kinds of buildings, they're identified because of ritual deposits. So sacrifices that are made at these places. And you can tell because there'll be a lot of gold objects around these places. A lot of the time, a lot of cattle bones, sometimes very specifically chosen. So, for example, just a lot of ox skulls. That's quite a common one you see in England. Or other signs that there were religious ceremonies going on at these places. And these buildings in Scandinavia are often quite small. They're not particularly large. Some do have posts in them or pillars, but it's not like the kind of huge Acropolis type buildings that we might be imagining from the classical world. Probably the best textual source that we have describing one of these pre-Christian sites of worship, at least before the Viking Age and not pertaining to Scandinavia, is from the Venerable Bede, who was an Anglo-Saxon, a Northumbrian monk, writing from Jarrow, that is, Monk Wearmouth Jarrow, where there are two monasteries in Northumberland today, then the Kingdom of Northumbria. And he describes the conversion of a certain pagan high priest, he calls him. This is in the time of King Edwin, who's a Northumbrian king. And this pagan high priest is at a pagan templum, Bede calls it, so temple, at Goodmanham, where this King Edwin, who has just converted to Christianity, wants to make all the Northumbrians Christian. So he goes to this pagan templum and encounters Coifi, who is interested in the new religion. And seeing the error of his ways, Coifi announces, For which reason I advise, O king, that we instantly abjure and set fire to those temples and altars which we have consecrated without reaping any benefit from them. And then the account goes on to say that he got on a horse, on a stallion, which before had not been lawful for pagan priests to ride. And then he grabbed a spear, and also that had not been lawful for him to do either, because they weren't allowed to be armed. He throws the spear into the temple, which is a way of violating it. It says he profaned it by doing so, and then he has the whole complex set on fire, and it burns to the ground. Now, this account has been taken literally by quite a lot of researchers, and one of the interesting things that I found while I was researching this is just how much of this account you can actually bring in from various points of the Bible and other accounts of missionaries. So to the point where the high priests, the definition that Bede uses, or the term rather that Bede uses for high priest, is primus pontificum, so the sort of the first pontificate in Latin. And this is exactly the same term that's used in the Latin Vulgate Bible in the Gospel of St. John for high priest, for a fella called Caiaphas. Now, Coifi and Caiaphas, and considering that the same term is being used for both of them, should already ring some alarm bells. And it gets even more suspicious because, of course, what is Coifi using is spear, but the word that's being used by Bede in the Latin is lancea, so where we get our word lance from. But that's quite an unusual word to be reading in medieval Latin. The vast majority of the time when Bede is writing about military encounters, he uses the word hasta, which is just spear. And again, that word lancea is the precise word that's used in the Gospel of St. John for the piercing of Christ's side. And we know that Bede, at the time of his death, was busy translating the Gospel of St. John, probably something he'd been doing for quite a while, something he was definitely interested in, had certainly read as a monk. So this is, again, makes you start to wonder. The connection between the two currently is just based on these words, but if we think about the actions that are going on, where you have this figure, Coifi, picking up this spear, and then the fact that it's called lancea, which links it to Christ, then rides into this temple and pierces the side of an idol with a spear before converting to Christianity, you can see again that this is suspicious. Another thing that makes it highly suspicious is the fact that he mentions that priests weren't allowed to bear arms or allowed to ride horses, when there's good evidence that this is precisely what priests, as in Christian priests, were being frowned upon for doing in the time that Bede was alive, rather than anything that's based on paganism. And furthermore, there's no evidence that there were pagan priests. For instance, there's nothing in any law code that comes after Christianity. There's no indication that any kind of parish system or clergy system that had been pagan was taken over by Christians, where you do have evidence, for example, in certain letters, like a letter from Pope Gregory, that any pagan temples or structures should be taken over and used for Christian churches. And there is some evidence that this happened. There's no evidence that there was a pagan priesthood at all. So quite likely Coifi is a figment of Bede's imagination. That name as well seems to just be an anglicization of Caiaphas, which he's taken from the Bible. And this makes sense in Bede's worldview. We tend to think that Bede is a good source on paganism because, well, Bede is an Englishman. Bede was a Northumbrian, and he was alive at a point where, pagans, when he was born in the end of the 7th century, pagans had been a very real thing just a generation before. Likely there were still many people who we would consider pagan, even if they might not. What we tend to forget is that Bede, from the age of 8, had lived in a monastery in Jarrow, and that this monastery in Jarrow, with its library, was full of those kinds of classical books that I mentioned earlier, books from the Mediterranean, learning about other Christian heroes like St. Augustine, St. Peter, other Christians that had gone out of their way to fight against pagans, be that in North Africa, be it in the Middle East. The Old Testament, of course, is full of references to paganism and to idolatry, and to the false ways in which idolatry manifests. And so even though Bede was an Anglo-Saxon, he'd grown up in, I can't remember which scholar said this, but an island of Mediterranean Christian learning in the northeast of England. Not too many of those around anymore. But you get my point, that we must then wonder, how much did Bede know from up to the age of 8? And then, of course, his whole adolescence and adult life had been spent translating and writing and contemplating and thinking about Christian teachings and the Bible and exegesis. And in fact, the very source in which it's recorded isn't the Historia Anglorum, it's the Historia Ecclesiastica Gentes Anglorum. So it's the history of the church of the English people. And that's very much what Bede was writing. It's a Christian history. It's not a straight up objective history. Bede would have used Anno Domini and before Christ and not BCE and CE. That's basically the point that I'm trying to get across. And so we have to be very skeptical about what he does write about paganism. But how about this? But that doesn't necessarily mean we have to throw the ritual bathwater out with baby Bede, because if we look at the way that he describes the site in the very beginning, he says temples and altars and sanctuaries of idols with fences surrounding them, the temple with all its fences. This sounds quite generic to begin with, but if we look at what is undisputably the most likely archaeological evidence of a pagan cult site in Anglo-Saxon England, in Northumbria no less, at a place called Yevering, we do find several enclosed structures. These are buildings with palisades around them, some with fences around them, and indeed some also with screens that divide them off from other buildings and other areas. Then we might have a precedent for the kind of fences or the hedges that Bede is describing in his account. Indeed, at Yevering, you have what appear to be certain fenced-off outdoor areas of worship, probably around posts that may be some kinds of carvings or depictions of deities, around which we found both bone remains and other offers, and also a cult building. So a building that appears to have had freestanding posts inside it. So these are basically posts that weren't holding up the roof, but that must have had some other kind of function, quite possibly a religious function, given the other kinds of things that we find around Yevering. So perhaps this is what Bede is describing there. But it makes it endlessly interesting to look at these accounts and to contrast not just the one source of evidence, so the written account, but then also to look at the archaeology. Now, Yevering at the time of Bede's birth had already been burnt to the ground, so it was no longer in place. So I'm not saying that, Bede's family went on a little pagan trip to Yevering and that Bede was remembering his fond childhood holidays as he was writing the history. But it's quite possible that there were still memories of this place, as this was, the kind of understood, this was what the pagan place looked like back then. And given that Bede was in the kingdom and speaking to presumably lots of people who had been alive in previous generations, in the generation of Edwin, for example, then it's not unthinkable that someone who had been at Yevering in the pagan time or had heard about what it was like potentially gave that information to Bede when Bede was interested in writing his history. It's interesting, and I think important more than anything as well, to realize that Bede didn't want to tell people about what had been happening in pagan times because it was so close to when Bede was writing. This is something that Bede is probably a little bit embarrassed about, the fact that his heroes, the Northumbrians, had at one point been pagan. He's obviously a very proud Christian and Northumbrian, and so he's writing his history in that light. It's not meant to be an explainer for pagan times in Northumbria. It's meant to be we were at one point not in the light of Christ, but we were actually okay already then, and we accepted it as quickly as we could, and now we're the best Christians out there. Anyway, that's just England, so that's just one example. Most of my examples and things I'm working with are from Frisia, where we get various missionaries coming over, most of them from England, who are going around and having encounters at these various fauna, at these sanctuaries or these sites. And archaeologically, there's very little evidence for what these were like at all, until very recently, at least. There's a very cool site that has been excavated in from 2019 to 2021. The English language article about that came out just at the start of this year, and that's really interesting. But I think I'll make a different video on that, about the first sort of undisputed large cult site in the Netherlands, where sacrifices were made and various deities appear to have been worshipped, and possibly also to have uncovered a second one at that. But yeah, so that's what I've been busy with. I've been doing an awful lot of writing in the last couple of months, a lot of reading, quite a bit of thinking, and to be honest, more just sort of trying to formulate different things into words. That's the kind of more tangible aspect of the thesis. The less tangible aspect goes all the way back into some Indo-European things and some crazy literature and poetry, and then the conclusion, which is yet to write, is going to try and bring it all together and see if anything reasonable comes out of that to present forward this new approach to something in the Lex Frisionum. And yeah, I will hear back from my long-suffering supervisor. But anyway, I'll try and get some new videos up. I'll get a new microphone, and then I can make some usual videos again, but maybe a bit less frequently, and potentially on some more topics of things that I've just been working on anyway that I'd like to share, rather than going out of my way to make a new video every time, because it does take a lot of time, and it's sort of time that I'm finding less and less easy to find, if that makes sense. Anyway, thank you all very much for sticking with it and for continuing to watch. I hope I'll be back again in a couple of weeks, hopefully with something new. In the meantime, check out Frisian with Hilbert. It's my second channel where I both teach some Frisian and teach some things about Frisian. Been enjoying that a lot. Something a little bit different, and a bit of a passion project, really, that one. But yeah, I hope you've all been well, and I'll see you all again soon. Catch you in the next one.